All right, we find ourselves in the third portion in the book of Exodus, and it's from chapters 10 all the way through 13, verse 16. And in this portion, which is titled Bo, which means go, you find the last three of the 10 plagues of Egypt. You have the invasion of the locusts, you have the darkness over Egypt, and of course you have the death of the firstborn. After that, you find that there was this Passover sacrifice. We talk about the blood and how it's a sign. And then you also find the Feast of Unleavened Bread being kind of set up in the dedication of the firstborn. And those are some of the big ticket items that we find in this portion. And I want to start off with a question. When we come rolling into the book of Exodus, who is it that we find being the antagonist in the story? You'll find pretty early on, it's none other than Pharaoh himself. Not only in the more recent chapters that we've covered is he asking the people to compromise and make little and less of what God instructs them to do, he actually commanded that there be eradication of the boys, that there would not be these Hebrew boys. We talked about how the midwives were set to kill them, and that didn't work. He decreed that they would be thrown into the Nile River. And of course, the very first sign that God uses as a plague to the Egyptian populace is showing them that they are still guilty of blood for what they had done in the heinous actions of Pharaoh years before. And when it comes to the struggle with Pharaoh, what is the struggle over? Well, it's of actually what this portion's named after, go. The struggle is Pharaoh not lessening his resolve and letting the people go and worship God and be the covenant people they're meant to be all along. And what I find interesting is Hebrew, the way it worked in ancient times, much like did other languages, their alphabet system and characters function not only as building blocks to words, but they also had what is known as gematria, meaning that their letters had numeric values and quantitative totals. So you could actually take a word and dissolve it to a number. And if you take the antagonist, you take Pharaoh in Hebrew, and you also take the word go in Hebrew and put them together, you actually come up with a total of 358. And why is that worth bringing to our attention? Well, I'm glad I asked the question if nobody else did. That's because there are two major, not just words, but two absolutely major characters in Scripture that share that numeric total of 358. And the first one we find all the way back in the beginning. If you go back to the book of Genesis and you start reading this whole narrative about the Garden of Eden, who's the antagonist there? We actually find it's a Nachash, or a serpent. It's the one that starts tempting man to take lesser value of what God says. He's asking the people to compromise on their obedience. And of course, whenever you get to the Egyptian culture, you even take a look at Pharaoh's headdress. What was on it? You actually find a pair of snakes. You actually find that the first signs prior to the plague, that the people's rods, their staffs, they were turned to snakes as well. And so how apropos is it that whenever we start taking a look at some of these finer details in Egypt, it kind of mirrors something that we've already seen take place in prior scriptures and prior books. Alongside that, I mentioned earlier, there's another word that numerically, it is equal to 358, but I think the character is far more than just equal to, it's greater than. It's the word of words. And the one that also equals 358 is the Messiah, or in Hebrew, Mashiach. All the damage and everything that was done by the serpent, the Messiah is going to come in and bring back to balance every bit of damage that was done all the way back in ancient times in the garden up to that point. Christ is able to bring balance to that and bring a semblance of having that relationship with God again. And we find that as a struggle that is prophesied all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. We find that being something playing out in the New Testament. And if you know how to read between the lines here in Exodus, we find the same thing happening, that there is a struggle between the forces of a serpent and trying to bind the people and get the people to compromise. And then you have a Savior or a Messiah who is in salvation, trying to deliver the people to a place where they can become covenant and holy unto God. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump into plague number 8. And of course, this is the one where it's about the locust, and God tells Moses and Aaron, go to Pharaoh and speak to Pharaoh. And all of this is done so that way these would act as signs in ways that would reveal God to the people, not just the Israelites, but everybody who's in the land of Egypt, to know that he is the Lord. And of course, it talks about how Pharaoh, he refused to let the people go. So here we come with the plague of the locusts. And so what I find very interesting here is, prior to this, we've already had 7 consecutive plagues happen and take place. And even in chapter 10, verse 7, Pharaoh's servants, his whole court, they're over it. They're completely done with this. And they even tell Pharaoh, why are you keeping these people around any longer? Because they're a burr in our saddle, they're a thorn to our sides, they're smoke to our eyes. We're tired of dealing with them. And you want to keep these people around? Like, why? What is the purpose? What is the point? And so, obviously, like I said, he doesn't let the people go quite yet. And so what happens? We have the invasion of locusts. And of course, even the plague prior to this, just that one plague, talks about how the crops were ravaged in the land of Egypt, about how they were taken down. You had the fire, you had the hail, you had everything that was beat to a pulp. The land was sore, the land was bruised, and the locusts came in and swarmed in, and it just made it all the worse. It was something absolutely awful. And it talked about how the trees were stripped bare. The little bit of vegetation that was left of the land, it was stripped bare. And I know a lot of people have this hesitancy about accepting the authority of the book of Exodus, because after all, it was written all this time ago. The details had to have been exaggerated. There exists a portion of people who don't even think it ever happened at all, that they believe it's all allegory and just glorified Aesop fables. And what I want to do at this point in time is I actually want to bring you back to a time 151 years ago in the land of America itself. In 1874, Midwest America was actually ravaged by what is known as the plague of locusts of 1874. And when you take a look at what had happened, it was these Rocky Mountain grasshoppers that were estimated on a downside, a minimum, historians say, were 120 billion grasshoppers that flooded and invaded the American Midwest. And again, that's what they consider to be the downside. The upside total, they estimate, is 12.5 trillion. And these things not only thrived, but they swarmed and decimated and eradicated farms. They eradicated levels. And no matter what you want to take a look at, nothing was safe. Nothing was holy to these grasshoppers at all in any way, shape, or form. And what I mean by that is, there was one thing I read just starting off. It talked about how there was these 15 acres worth of land this one farmer had. And when the locusts came in a less than 3-hour total amount of time, these grasshoppers leveled and eradicated everything. 15 acres worth of land. And I heard it said years ago that roughly an acre is akin to like a football field. So imagine 15 football fields worth of crops, worth of vegetation, totally brought down to absolutely nothing in a time span of lesser than breakfast to lunch. That is just insane to me. But during this time, it talked about how these locusts would come to the lands, and it really hurt the people because, like, about a decade prior, there was the Homestead Act, where the people actually were moving towards west in the land. They were expanding on the Manifest Destiny, and they were trying to settle out on these lands and have property of their own, having crops, having vegetation, land, animals. And whenever these locusts came in, it talks about how they would eat the bark off of trees. Whenever these farmers would start plowing their lands, they would use axes, they would use pitchforks, they would use various tools. Well, whenever they sweat on these tools, it transferred salt onto the surface of these tools. The locusts, whenever they shown up and came, they were actually eating the wooden handles off of the tools. And of course, imagine what happened to all the leather for like the tack for the horses. Leather was ate up. So whether it was aprons, whether it was bridles, all sorts of things. The grasshoppers just came in and decimated absolutely everything. There was one recorded instance to where the sky was blackened for about 6 hours because things were so thick in the sky it blocked the visibility of the sun. People would go to bed and they would have to shake off all their bedclothes because they would be littered and full of grasshoppers. And when they woke up the next morning, they had to do it all over again because they repopulated in the house overnight. There was instances where it talked about these grasshoppers were so thick they would land on the trees, and the weight of grasshoppers Mind you, not people. The weight of grasshoppers was so big and so vast that tree branches would snap. Whole branches would snap off because of the weight of grasshoppers. That is insane to me. Talks about how some people would actually wind up trying to burn brush, or they would burn some things hoping the smoke would drive these things away. And the amount of grasshoppers were so thick, they would actually be able to snuff out the fire with their own bodies. Obviously, some of the grasshoppers would die. Farmers would begin to plow their lands and find out grasshoppers had laid eggs in the earth. And so then they would have to plow up all the ground. They would throw hay and stubble and other things in the ground, and they would try to burn out the eggs. And this is something that lasted for a good while. But talk about like wagons. Wagons would be eaten up. They would even eat paint, which blew my mind. On top of that, it talks about like the wool. They would eat the wool, which I didn't even know was a thing either. There was even a time where it talked about how they were so thick on the face of the earth that these grasshoppers were on the railroads, and they were getting crushed in such copious amounts that trains would no longer have traction on railroad tracks because of all the guts that were on the iron or on the steel. They were so thick that the guts made it to where there was no traction for these trains. And think about how that messed, even in the Americas, as advanced as we like to think ourselves to be, even 151 years ago, it really messed with the Western culture at the time. And so when this happened and would take place, this locust plague all the way back in the book of Exodus, these poor people were already ravaged 7 times over with other plagues. They already had this unbelievable hail along with thunderings and fires, whatever, and it would ravage the land. And while these people are licking their wounds, all of a sudden the locusts come down and just wipe everything off from the face of the earth. Whenever God is showing that he's wanting to reveal himself to the people and really break them and their psyche of this pantheon's going to show and give them everything, I'm starting to think God really meant what he said. Kind of going back to one last little thing that I read about this whole thing with the grasshoppers in the American Midwest. They had chickens. The farmers are actually applying for grants and like government protection over particular birds that would help eat these grasshoppers. And whenever you would have like what was left behind, the defecation of the grasshoppers, along with the bodies of the grasshoppers, you would have water channels that would totally be unusable. So the livestock, animals, people, they wouldn't even be able to use the water because it was so saturated with death and byproduct of grasshoppers. And even with like chickens and turkeys that wound up living through all of this, it even said that these birds, they themselves became inedible because they had such a heavy grasshopper diet that the meat and the eggs were tainted with like this filmy oil. It blows my mind. And so I kind of think with these Egyptians, like, what did they have to deal with if we had to deal with this now? Like, there are things that we are finally in our time in history discovering meticulous details about that really help enhance what happened all the way back then when it comes to the plagues, when it comes to the times more ancient of the Bible. And so Exodus 10 tells us everything was so severe that the fruit of the trees was gone. It talks about how there weren't any plants of the field left in Egypt. And so Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron in haste, and he says, look, I know that I've sinned before God, so take this away from me. If you want to, go out and worship. And of course, there's no compromise there. That's the one really good thing about Moses and Aaron, was they were unflinching. They were not willing to compromise in what God had told them to do. And that is necessary leadership, is that we cannot phase ourselves. We cannot allow ourselves that hesitation, that flicker of hesitation. We have to be bold in what our mission is and what we are supposed to do. And of course, with the 9th plague, we have the darkness. It talks about stretch your hands towards the heaven that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt. Darkness which is heavy enough that it's even going to be felt. And I don't know, and this might be a little bit dramatic. Whenever I think of this darkness, it almost thinks of like a really thick fog or a really thick mist. There have been times where I've been out at work having to drive equipment to where my clothes will become saturated because I'm driving through this cloud, essentially, of fog. And I almost have to think that kind of what that darkness might have been, I don't know. But I think with Egypt, with it being so their polypantheon, like just huge, vast amount of gods, talks about how Pharaoh's court had magicians. It was a land of spiritual darkness. And it talks about how there was going to be this darkness for 3 days that the people won't even be able to see each other. They won't be able to rise from their place. But I love what verse 23 says. But all of the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. And I love how God says again, I'll make a distinction between my people and the people of the land. And even in the times of such thick darkness to where it presses on the souls of the people, it is that thick and that dark, my people will have light amongst themselves. I think that's kind of a mission statement to us, that as dark as things get in this world and it's a lot of our surroundings where we find ourselves being, be the light. It is that important. And of course, Pharaoh says, okay, take your flocks and go, but leave your children. Again, they're unflinching. They don't hesitate. They say, we're not going to do that. And of course, the death of the firstborn is announced. We find that taking place in Exodus chapter 11. And Moses and Aaron did all these signs and wonders before Pharaoh, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the children of Israel go out of his hand. Thus we find the Passover instituted. And I want us to drop down, and it starts talking about in verse, I believe it's 5, the lamb shall be without blemish, a male in the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. Very interesting wording. But what I want to point our attention to is when it talks about how you are to take this lamb or this sacrifice, you and your neighbor, if your numbers are small, together, take one. It talks about how it has to be within the first year. It has to represent innocence. There can't be a blemish about this lamb. And one of the things I want to draw our attention to about this is, like I said, the innocence of the sacrifice itself. I know a lot of people think these sacrifices of the Old Testament are barbaric, they're bloody, they're gory. Here's the thing. They weren't ever meant to be something light and lighthearted and giggles and all cute little Sunday school for children stories. There is a certain gravity to them that we are to experience and we are to feel. When you read it here in verse 6, it talks about you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. They actually had to spend time with this sacrifice. They had to take care of it. And whenever you take care of something, there is a bonding element that happens and it takes place. Whenever they would actually sacrifice this animal, they were going to feel a sense of loss. And even on the broader spectrum of like the Levitical sacrifices, we'll study those later when we get to those in later portions. When it talks about they were to put their hands on the head of the sacrifice, it's not just like they like very lightly, very gently put their hand on the animal. They actually used their weight and put it up against the animal to where it was supporting their weight. It was supporting their person, because they recognized that this sacrifice is taking my place. I should be the one experiencing this death, but this is a sacrificial, this is a substitutionary sacrifice. And I'm seeing all these things here, and it just kind of reminds me, we aren't to take the sacrifice lightly. And of course, we know it's the body and the blood. The blood is what brought God near to the people and allowed them to pass over. The body of the lamb gave them nourishment for them to travel to the base of a mountain to become a covenant people. It allowed them the strength to go out and walk out of bondage and restriction to where they were brought to the feet of a mountain, to where they pledged themselves in covenant to God. It's not just one or the other. It's finding value in both. Whenever we go to the Gospels, we find Christ talking about how this sacrifice talks about this wine, it's the blood of my body. And it talks about the body, this bread is my body. It's what gives us that nourishment. It's what gives us that strength. It's what allows us to walk to the promises. And so I just want us to keep that in mind. It talks about the whole congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight, and it'll be put on the doorposts. And a lot of people are very familiar with a lot of the stuff on Passover. We'll go in more depth on that at a later time. Also, keep in mind whenever he was crucified, when did that happen? Just FYI. But I want us to take a look at verse 13. Now the blood shall be a sign for you and on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. And I want to draw our attention to the word sign in Hebrew. It's 3 letters long. It's Aleph, Vav, Tav. Okay, so what's important? What's so special that we have to talk about this? Well, we're not as familiar, I think, in the church with Hebrew as we are the Greek. And so let's just take a look at the bookend letters, the first and final letter. If it's not in Hebrew, the Aleph Tav, what is it in Greek? It's the Alpha and the Omega. Now that center letter, that Vav, it's actually in the shape of a Roman nail. And it literally means nail. How interesting that the blood of this animal is to be a sign. We find that sign, the Alpha and Omega, pierced with a Roman nail. That blood is to be a sign of the Passover, that God will not strike us in this land of bondage, in this land of restriction. And of course, that blood came from a body, that body that was broken, beaten for us, by whom stripes we are healed. Again, we find these messianic implications that are so thick and saturated in the stories, in the words, in the happenings, and what it harkens back to, what it's a prophecy of what's going to happen in the New Testament. You've heard it probably said 100 times before that the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed. The New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. And we need to quit making these two things seem like they're, opposite items of the end of the ticket, one side of the coin versus the other, and they're not even the same. They are two things on the same coin, that you have to have both of them. You can't just have one. And it's this whole story about how God is working through redeeming the people in the world. And then whenever we find this death of the firstborn in Egypt, God does not take that lightly. He even says there has to be a redemption of the firstborn, including the livestock later on, because he can't do what had happened in Egypt without it having something that has to be given back in the future. Life has to be pledged. If life has to be taken, life has to be promised. And so by the time we get to the end of Exodus chapter 12, we find that Pharaoh's resolve is finally broken. And, just thinking about the position of the Egyptians in the land, they've already had 10 consecutive and 10 in a way worsening plagues stacked right on top of each other. The whole people, including Pharaoh himself, probably were thinking, okay, this needs to stop. And of course, we know it ended at 10, but maybe these people thought it could just get worse and worse and worse. And what is the one thing being cried between every plague? Let the people go. So finally, he concedes, he bows the head, he gets a little bit of humility, and he lets the people go. And he says, not only just you, not only your generation, your kids, your livestock, get everything and go. And it talks about as they were leaving that there was such an urgency in the land of Egypt that they forfeited a lot of their goods, the Egyptians, to the people of Israel. We find these items would be used later on in consecration, holy, used to God. And I want to turn our attention to our closing part in chapter 13. Let's go down to, we're going to be two things we're going to look at in this chapter. Number one is verse 4. On this day you're going out in the month of Aviv. Now, when you get into words in Hebrew, especially names where they start with A-B in English, Abram, Abraham, Abimelech, Absalom, Abigail, the list goes on and on and on. If it starts with A-B, it's indicative of the word Av, which means something to do with father. If you find where it's A-B-I, that's congruent to Hebrew of Aleph, Bet, Yud, which means my father. And so whenever you see Aviv, you find my father. And the one letter that's left is the letter Bet. And it's the same letter that starts things like Bethsaida, Bethlehem, Beth Shemesh, which means house of. And I find it interesting that when it talks about this month of Aviv, that this is the month that the people are finally becoming concentrated and holy unto God, that this is the time where they're coming into my father's house, or you are a house for my father, a special people. And I want us to go and take a look. Whenever the Exodus happened, it wasn't just the Israelite people. It actually says in text that it was a mixed multitude. This isn't something that was just for the Hebrews, or what we would consider now later on just for the Jews only. This is an invitation that was given to the nations all across the world. Something important for us to look at. And so when you go a little bit further in the chapter, it talks about the law of the firstborn, and it talks about how through all of this, we mentioned early on about how this wasn't supposed to be just for you as an individual. These things that you encounter, these weren't to be locked in your brain forever and never spoken of. These were things that you would see and that you would talk to your son about, to your children, and even their children. This was something that was going to be an overflowing cup to multiple generations and fall into their lap. It wasn't one thing. When Pharaoh asked, you can go, but I ask you to keep your children. We're not compromising. It's not just for us only. This is for generations. This is for endurance. And I think that's a big message of the month of Aviv. But it was to teach the people that God is sufficient. And if God acts on your behalf, we have to find sufficiency in that. And if you're ever part of a Passover seder, there is what is known or called as a song called the Daenu. And it says, if only God would have done this for us, that would have been sufficient. If God would have done this for us, it would have been sufficient. And it gives this Haggadah, or this telling of the story of everything that God had done for the people to get them out of Egypt, to create a people unto himself. And they actually sing this Daenu. And it comes from the word like Shaddai, or Shaddai comes from this word, one or the other, I can't remember offhand. And when it talks about these are things, our signs are meant to help you remember and bring that to the forefront of your mind. When you get to 13:16, it talks about it shall be a sign on your hand and in the frontlets between your eyes, for by the strength and the hand of the Lord brought us out of Egypt. They're talking about tefillin. They're talking about these things that are phylacteries, that are bound to their arms or they're bound to their foreheads. And I think of all the way back in Genesis about things that are created and things that are done by God, how they're mimicked by other people later on. Even in the book of Exodus and prior portions, we find where you would have the signs, the wonders, and a couple of the plagues take place. You find Pharaoh's court, the magicians. They were able to, I can't even say full-on replicate, but they had these counterfeit signs that they would do, that they would attempt to mimic God. And I think that's a tactic that the enemy is trying to find enough things that punch enough holes, that punch enough checks in a box to make it really make you feel like, oh, this is something good. God does this, and this is basically the same thing. If he can mimic the cry or mimic the action of God enough, the surface level is going to be enough for, unfortunately, most of the people. And so when we get to the tefillin, or these phylacteries that are talking about that they're stripped and bound to the arms of the individuals, to the hand, whenever they're bound on their forehead, these are things that are supposed to help remember and remind the individuals that God is sufficient and that he is helping meet our needs. Why do I mention this in the context of mimicking and counterfeit? Go to the book of Revelation. You have what is known as the mark of the beast, to where people, your needs aren't going to be met unless you have this mark on your hand or on your head. We find that this supposition, this whole thing about the mark of the beast, it's a mimic of the mark of God. We find Cain had this sign that was placed on him. And then here we find almost direct verbiage of what we're probably more familiar with in the book of Revelation than even here. That it's going to be on their hand, their works, their deed. It's to remind them, and every time they look down, it's a sign to the world. It's a sign to themselves. And we find all the way in the book of Revelation that we find the enemy, he's trying to show in a way that the only way things are going to be sufficient in your life is if you mimic and give me the adoration, if you give me the praise, and if you give me the worship. That belongs to God alone. There is no person, no idol, there's no fear that is supposed to take the place of God. And that is what the Antichrist, that's what we're going to find happening in the book of Revelation. The one who is the opposite of the Messiah, the one who is of the Nachash nature, not of the Messiah nature. And that's one of the big things that we talk about in the land of Egypt that we read into the text. It's already there. It is a place of bondage and a place of restriction where God is trying to give us freedoms and realize our needs are met and that he is sufficient for everything it is that we have and everything that we need. So as always, thank you for your time. Be blessed.